While Donald Trump was threatening Canada with tariffs, economic retaliation, and even floating annexation rhetoric, something far more consequential was unfolding quietly, thousands of kilometers away. It wasn't announced in Washington. It wasn't debated on cable news, and it wasn't noticed by most American analysts until it was already too late. On January 15, 2026, standing before reporters in Beijing, Canada's Energy Minister Tim Hodgson delivered a sentence that effectively ended decades of American energy leverage over Canada. We produce the lowest carbon intensity LNG in the world. China is an investor in our first LNG project. They will be an investor in our second LNG project. And they are a major user of our conventional oil and gas. That statement wasn't a talking point. It was a declaration of structural change. Hours later, Prime Minister Mark Carney made it official. Canada will scale liquefied natural gas exports to 50 million tons per year by 2030. Every ton will be shipped to Asian markets. Not one ton is earmarked for the United States. This wasn't diversification. This was disengagement. For generations, American policymakers assumed Canadian energy was captive. Geography, pipelines, and infrastructure made the United States the default destination. Canadian oil and gas flowed south because there was no alternative. That dependency created leverage. And Trump believed that leverage was permanent. He was wrong, because while Trump focused on punishing allies, Canada focused on building exits. The LNG expansion now underway in British Columbia represents $109 billion in capital investment, the largest energy infrastructure build-out in Canadian history. 7 export terminals, deep-water Pacific ports, liquefaction plants powered by hydroelectric energy instead of gas combustion, long-term contracts signed with Asian buyers before facilities are even complete. This is not a policy choice that can be reversed. This is physical infrastructure. Once LNG terminals are built, they operate for 30 to 40 years. Once contracts are signed, volumes cannot be redirected. Once Asian buyers integrate Canadian LNG into their energy security planning, the United States becomes irrelevant. And here is the detail Washington completely failed to grasp. China is not merely purchasing Canadian LNG. China is owning part of it. Through LNG Canada, Chinese firms already hold equity stakes alongside Shell, Petronas, Mitsubishi, and Kogas. Ownership guarantees supply. Ownership insulates against political risk. Ownership embeds Canadian production directly into China's long-term energy planning. Trump believed energy dominance gave him power over Canada. Instead, his threats accelerated the very infrastructure that destroyed that power. For decades, American leverage rested on a single assumption: Canada had nowhere else to go. The moment Canada proved that assumption false, the entire strategy collapsed. This is why the announcement shocked Washington. Not because Canada is exporting LNG, but because the United States is excluded by design. The terminals face west. The pipelines point toward the Pacific. The shipping routes bypass American territory entirely. Even if Washington wanted Canadian LNG tomorrow, it could not access it. The facilities are not built for the United States. The contracts are not written for the United States. The financing does not depend on the United States. Trump did not lose leverage because Canada betrayed America. He lost it because Canada stopped trusting American stability. Tariffs announced by tweet. Trade agreements treated as temporary. Allies described as burdens. Sovereignty joked about publicly. No rational government builds 50-year infrastructure on that foundation. So Canada didn't. Instead, Ottawa made a calculation that will define North American energy for decades. If the American market is unpredictable, build for Asia. If American goodwill cannot be relied upon, replace it with contracts. If energy is being weaponized, remove the weapon from your opponent's hands. That is exactly what Canada did. And by the time Washington noticed, the concrete was already being poured. To understand why this shift is irreversible, you have to look beyond headlines and into the mechanics of how energy power actually works. This is not about diplomacy. This is about infrastructure, capital, contracts, and time horizons measured in decades. Canada's LNG pivot is not theoretical. It is being poured into concrete, steel, and ports along British Columbia's coastline right now. As of early 2026, Canada has 7 major LNG export projects, either under construction or in advanced development, all concentrated on the Pacific coast. Together, they represent 50.3 million tons of annual export capacity and up to $109 billion in total capital investment by the end of this decade. This matters because LNG is not oil. You cannot simply reroute it. You cannot flip a switch and send it somewhere else. Liquefaction facilities are built for specific shipping routes, specific buyers, and specific contract structures. Once they exist, they lock trade flows in place for generations. The anchor project, LNG Canada in Kitimat, is already operational. Its initial 2 liquefaction trains will produce 14 million tons per year, with expansion plans that could raise capacity to 26 million tons annually. That alone would rival some of the largest LNG exporters in the world. And LNG Canada is only the beginning. Cedar LNG, Woodfibre LNG, Kasai Lysims LNG, and multiple additional projects are scheduled to come online between 2027 and 2030. Every single one of them is designed for Asian markets only. No Atlantic terminals, no Gulf Coast shipping, no connection to American infrastructure. The United States is not being deprioritized. It is being structurally bypassed. This is where Chinese, Japanese, and Korean investment becomes decisive. Energy security for Asia is not just about buying fuel. It is about owning supply. Equity stakes guarantee access even during shortages. They insulate buyers from price spikes and political interference. And they make supply disruptions someone else's problem. China understood this long before Washington did. By investing directly in Canadian LNG facilities, China ensured that Canadian gas would not become a bargaining chip in future trade wars. Once Chinese capital is embedded in Canadian infrastructure, the United States cannot sanction, pressure, or redirect that supply without confronting multiple Asian governments simultaneously. That is deterrence through ownership. From Canada's perspective, the benefits compound. Asian buyers are willing to sign 20 to 30-year contracts. They accept long-term pricing structures. They finance infrastructure upfront. And they do not threaten annexation, tariffs, or political retaliation if Ottawa pursues independent policy. Compare that with the American market. Trump's first term saw tariffs imposed on allies, trade agreements rewritten under threat, and energy turned into a geopolitical weapon. His second term escalated that approach. Canadian energy executives watched this closely. They saw pipelines become political targets. They saw tariffs imposed without warning. They saw the language around sovereignty shift from unthinkable to casual. No board of directors builds 50-year assets under those conditions. Asia, by contrast, offered what the United States could not: predictability. China needs LNG at massive scale. In 2025 alone, Asia imported roughly 270 million tons of LNG. By 2030, that number is expected to exceed 350 million tons, driven primarily by China and India. China AS LNG demand alone is projected to rise from 90 million tons to over 120 million tons within 5 years. Canada's planned 50 million tons does not flood the market. It fits neatly into projected demand growth. And Canada offers something few exporters can match: the lowest carbon intensity LNG in the world. British Columbia's hydroelectric grid powers liquefaction, cutting emissions nearly in half compared to global averages. For Asian governments facing climate pressure, Canadian LNG is politically easier to defend. This is why Japan's Mitsubishi and Korea's Kogas joined the ownership structure. This is why China committed to being an investor, not just a buyer. This is why Canada suddenly went from marginal LNG player to one of the most strategically important future suppliers in the Pacific. Meanwhile, the United States watched its leverage evaporate. For decades, Washington assumed Canadian energy would always flow south. Pipelines reinforced that belief. Geography reinforced it. Habit reinforced it. Trump treated that assumption as power. But infrastructure changes assumptions. With Trans Mountain, Canada proved it could export oil to Asia. With LNG Canada and its successors, Canada proved it could export gas at scale. Once those two pillars were in place, American leverage collapsed. Even if Trump wanted to pressure Canada tomorrow, there is nothing left to threaten. Canadian energy no longer depends on American access. It no longer depends on American goodwill, and it no longer depends on American stability. By attempting to weaponize trade, Trump forced Canada to build immunity. And immunity, once built, cannot be taken away. What makes this shift so dangerous for Washington is not what Canada did. It is what the United States can no longer undo. Energy power is not about speeches or tariffs. It is about who controls supply routes when markets tighten, when crises hit, and when governments panic. For decades, America assumed it would always sit at the center of North American energy flows. Canada would produce. The United States would buy, refine, distribute, and dictate terms. That era just ended. With Pacific LNG infrastructure locked in, Canada's energy future is no longer hostage to American politics. The liquefaction terminals rising along British Columbia's coast are not short-term projects. They are 40-year assets. They will operate into the 2060s and 2070s, long after Trump, long after Carney, long after today's geopolitical arguments are forgotten. Infrastructure outlives ideology. Once LNG plants come online, contracts activate automatically. Volumes flow. Payments are settled. Ships sail. And no tweet, tariff, or threat can reroute them without catastrophic legal and financial consequences. This is why Trump's reaction will matter less than his inability to respond. He can complain, he can threaten, he can accuse Canada of betrayal, but he cannot tear down terminals already financed, insured, and partially owned by Asian state-backed firms. He cannot cancel 25-year supply contracts governed by international arbitration. And he cannot force Canada to rebuild infrastructure that points east instead of west. Energy leverage only works before alternatives exist. Canada built the alternative. From Beijing's perspective, this is strategic insurance. Canadian LNG reduces dependence on the Middle East, avoids Russian political risk, and bypasses American choke points like the Panama Canal. It also arrives from a democratic, rule-of-law jurisdiction with strong institutions and predictable governance. From Tokyo and Seoul's perspective, Canadian LNG offers long-term stability without exposure to Gulf conflicts or American domestic chaos. Ownership stakes guarantee access even during shortages. For the first time in modern history, Canada is no longer forced to accept American market access as the price of energy exports. It can choose partners. It can negotiate terms. It can walk away. That changes everything. Trump believed energy dependence guaranteed obedience. Instead, his pressure accelerated diversification. Every tariff threat made Asian contracts more attractive. Every annexation joke made Pacific infrastructure politically inevitable. Every trade war announcement convinced Canadian executives that America was no longer a reliable anchor market. The irony is brutal. Trump wanted dominance. He delivered independence. And the consequences extend far beyond LNG. Once Canada proves it can redirect energy flows at this scale, every other sector reevaluates its exposure to the United States. Critical minerals, electricity, interties, manufacturing supply chains, agricultural exports. The logic spreads. If energy can be decoupled, nothing is sacred. Washington now faces a new reality. Canada is no longer a captive supplier. It is a strategic competitor in Asia, backed by Chinese, Japanese, and Korean capital, shipping directly into the world's fastest-growing markets. And there is no reset button. The terminals will not be dismantled. The contracts will not expire early. The capital will not leave. Trump's leverage over Canadian energy did not weaken. It vanished. This is what real power loss looks like in geopolitics. Not defeat in war, not collapse, just the quiet realization that threats no longer work. It simply built around it. And by the time Washington noticed, the concrete had already dried, the contracts were signed, and the ships were already scheduled. Not because America was attacked,